Hello. We're going to talk about the social impact of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so do you remember before, everything we've talked about before, there were really two social classes. There were the rich people and there was everybody else. Well, now, during the Industrial Revolution, because of factories and entrepreneurs, this new class developed. And this new class is called the middle class. So we had the upper class. These are your rich people, like really, really rich people. And now you've got your middle class. These are your entrepreneurs, you know, like your factory owners, those kind of people. And then you have the working class, and that's everyone else. Everyone else. So, before, really the only people that could afford things like buying books or buying nice clothes were the upper class. But suddenly you've got this middle class, and the middle class is really doing all right for themselves. They live in nice houses with running water in their houses. They can buy nice clothes. They have paved streets with like pretty and clean paved streets, and someone comes and hauls their garbage away for them, and everything's really kind of nice. That's what it's like in the middle class neighborhoods. So one difference between the middle class and the upper class was in the middle class, they could afford for the woman to not work. The woman didn't have to work, but they couldn't quite afford a nanny. So, like in the upper classes, women, they didn't take care of babies. Ugh. I mean, they'll have a baby, but they're not gonna change diapers or clean up puke. They paid people to do that for them. They had somebody that took care of their children, and they just kind of got to peek in on them in the morning and evening and be like, hi, I'm your mom. But they didn't really raise them. They were raised by someone else that lived in the home and was paid to take care of their children. The middle class, mom didn't have to work, but they couldn't afford to hire somebody to take care of their children. So mom did the cooking and the cleaning and the raising of the children, while dad was off running his business. So that's the difference. The upper class had everything. The middle class was doing all right. You know, they had a house, they had running water, they had clean paved streets, they had new clothes. Mom didn't have to work. And, you know, they would have pretty areas. They might have flowers growing in front of their house. Now, the working class, everyone else, these people had nothing. They were so poor. They lived in places called tenements, which is, I can tell you what a tenement is. Imagine your house, wherever you live. I've never been to your house. I have no idea if you live in a small apartment or if you live in a huge house, but whatever. Take every single room in your house, like including the living room, in not just the bedrooms, anywhere where there actually is space, and put 25 people in that room. Like, think about, look around, take 1 second and look around the room that you're sitting in right now. Wherever you're watching me and listening to my voice, look around your room. Do you think 25 people could live in that room? Now, put another 25 in your parents' room. Put another 25 in your sister's room. Put another 25 in your living room. And that's what tenements were like. And they didn't have anyone to take their trash out for them. And they didn't have running water. They pooped and they peed just like in a bucket in the corner. And when the bucket was full, they threw it out of the window. And so it just went all over the streets. It was nasty. Like, that's where their garbage went. You had garbage, you just threw it out of the window. You had poop, you had pee in a bucket, you threw it out of the window. It was rough. Everything smelled bad. Like, think about, I know it's been a while since you've had PE class, but I also know that you have an imagination. Imagine if there were 25 of you in a classroom and you all had PE on a hot day in June. It's hot, it's gross, you're all sweaty and kind of gross smelling. And then all 25 of you crammed into one bedroom and had to live together. First off, how difficult, like, imagine how many fights people would get in. You just bicker and argue with people because they're so close to you. And then they smell bad. And then they're pooping in a bucket in the corner. And there's nothing to eat because everybody's broke and hungry. Think about how grumpy you get when you're hungry. Now, think of how grumpy everyone gets when they're hungry. And they're stinky. And it's just, tenement houses were really, really not pleasant places to be. But that's all anyone could afford. They didn't have anything but their job. And remember, I was going to change the page, but I'll stay here. Remember, why are people living in the city? They're living in the city because the rich people from the countryside stole their land from them. They were peasants. You know, they didn't really officially own anything because they were peasants, but they had this land that they grew their food on. Well, the rich people came along and said, oh, this land belongs to me now. And the peasants had no choice. They went to the cities. But when they got to the city, what were they going to do? The only thing they had ever done before was farm. So now they're desperate and they're seeking just any source of money that they can get so they can feed their children while they've got everybody crammed into a tenement. And it was bad, and everybody worked. The mom worked, the dad worked, the kids worked, as young as 5 years old. 5-year-old kids were working like all day. The average work day was 12 to 16 hours. You go to school, today, right now, you go to school really from 9 to 12, that's 3 hours. But imagine a regular school day and non-pandemic times, school is 8 hours. And it feels really long to you, right? Like, doesn't school feel long? Well, let's add that you are doing hard physical labor. We're saying hard work. and it's 12 to 16 hours with no breaks. No breaks. Average workday, 12 to 16 hours, no breaks. I'm gonna erase that 8 hours because that was just to tell you how long you go to school. I don't want you to write that down. Now, I'm just looking at my notes. Okay, so from 1811 to 1813, well, really in the early 1800s, these things called labor unions came about. I am a big fan of labor unions. So labor unions is when all the workers get together and form like a club and try to go to their boss and say, we have all agreed on something. You should pay us more. You should let us work less hours. You should, I don't know, a labor union is kind of like, I don't know, if, let's say, all of you that are listening to me right now decide that I'm giving you too much work. And you all get together and you form a union, like union means to join together. You form a union together and you decide, it has nothing to do with me. You guys decide what you think your world history class should look like. And then you come to me with it. And there were these huge protests. The first labor union protests really were between these 2 years, 1811 and 1813. They had big labor protests, and many of them turned into riots because they would do things like they would make a list of demands and go to the boss, and the boss would say no. And so what happened was the people walked out. They said, oh yeah, you're not gonna meet our demands, we're gonna walk out. How are you gonna run your factory without your workers? And they all walked out. But that was a really serious thing for them because they didn't have any money. These people were only making enough money to live day to day. Like, if they didn't work today, they didn't have money to feed their kids tomorrow. And they felt so strongly about this that they walked out. Let me tell you about the work conditions, why they did this. The work conditions were bad. I mean, really bad. In the factories, and mostly we're talking about textile factories here. What were textiles? Textiles are cloth. So in the textile factories, there was just cotton flying in the air everywhere. Sometimes it got so thick you couldn't see. And you put your hand right in front of your face and you couldn't see your hand. But they weren't wearing any masks. So they were just breathing in that cotton. And what do you think happens to people when they work 16 hours a day, breathing in cotton all day, every day? They get sick. They get really sick. Then also, there were the factories and the mines. The mines were getting coal to power the engines to run the machines. And they were also mining iron to build the machines. So they were mining coal and iron. They were mining some other stuff, but mostly we're talking about coal and iron. Mines are really, really scary, really dangerous places. So they go into caves in mountains. This is like a dark, dark cave that I'm drawing here. They go into a cave, and a man has a little tool, little pick like this, and he holds it in his hand like this, and he picks at the side of the, like the inside of the mountain, and gets what he needs, and they have like railroad tracks that go in there, and but it's not really railroads, they have cars, not cars like you're thinking, cars that look like this, and then the person is like here and pushes this car in on the track, and they dig out what they want, and they load up this car, and then they pull it back out, and then they take it for processing. But while they're in there chipping away, sometimes the whole cave collapses on them. Sometimes people get trapped in there. Sometimes they're rescued, sometimes they're not. If they have rocks fall on them, they're gone. It's really dangerous. Not only is it dangerous from the rocks falling, just like in the textile factories where there's cotton in the air, in these caves, there's coal in the air. You don't want to be breathing coal. People that breathe in coal all day, every day, hour after hour, they get very, very, very sick. Very sick. So there were children. Like I said, don't forget, there were children doing this work as young as 5 years old. And that's because these people were so poor. They were so poor. If anyone could work, they had to work. The minute children were old enough to do something that could make some money somehow, they were put to work. All right, so during this time, religion made a comeback. So, we recently talked about the Enlightenment and how people were kind of, religion's dumb. And there was this big boom in science. Well, the big boom and excitement of science that led to industrialization and machinery and very, very low wages. A wage is what you're paid. This is your salary, your money. When I get my paycheck for teaching you, it's my wage. That's supposed to be an A. It's W-A-G-E, your wage. So there were very low wages. People were working in really horrific, really, really bad conditions for hours and hours and hours every day. Well, 6 days. They usually worked 6 days a week at 12 to 16 hours a day. And I can't even really express to you how bad the working conditions were. It was bad. But because of that, this guy named John Wesley who was a preacher, he started preaching to these people. He went to the working class neighborhoods. He went to the tenements, and he started telling them, there's a better life ahead of you. Sure, this life is horrible. This life is terrible. But if you just believe in God and you pray, when you die, you're going to go to heaven. You're going to go to a better place. This life right now is terrible. But later, after death, you're going to have a beautiful life for eternity with God, and everything is going to be great. And his particular denomination is called Methodist. It's Christian. So before, mostly the only religion that we really talked about was Catholicism, Catholics. But I'm going to do a little bitty, short little side trip here. So there was the Catholic Church, and that's all there was. There were just the Catholics. But then there was a break. I don't really have time to get into it as to why, but there was a break and the Protestant church began. So now there were the Catholics and the Protestants. But underneath the Protestants, today, underneath the Protestants, there are like 2,000 different Protestant denominations. And one of them, let's say this one, is Methodist. Methodist. They are Christian. They're Christian, they're Protestant, Methodists. So John Wesley, big name, know this name, John Wesley took advantage of how awful people's living situations were. And he went to them and he told them, your suffering will not be forgotten by God. If you just dedicate your life to God and you pray, when you die in this world, you're going to go on to a greater world, which is called heaven, and you're going to be really happy. You're going to get everything that you ever wanted, everything you could never have here, you're going to get when you go to heaven. And this was big because religion had kind of started fading away. And now religion has this big comeback because people were desperate. And when people are desperate and you tell them something good is going to happen to them, they latch onto that. And so this Methodist church became really, really big during the Industrial Revolution. Okay, there were also people called Luddites. Luddites are anti-technology. You can still use this word today. Like I use this word a lot to tease people. If I personally use cell phones as much as you do. But my mom's generation, they don't really use cell phones so much. I mean, they might have one. Like, I'm sure my mom has a cell phone, but she doesn't have any like apps on it. She uses it just as a phone. Like, my mom doesn't even send text messages. She picks it up, she picks up the phone, she dials a number, and she calls. And that's all she'll do with a telephone. No no apps for anything. And people older than her often won't even have a cell phone. And they'll say things like, well, I didn't have a cell phone when I was a child and I turned out just fine. So anyone that is like, you know, they trash talk new modern things, that's a Luddite. And there were Luddite rebellions at this time when they would go like late at night and they would burn down a factory. And I understand where they were coming from. So people used to sew clothes by hand. They used to sew clothes by hand. And then along came the machine that made the clothes. Well, what happens to the person that used to sew by hand when now there's a machine to do it? Now they're out of work. And so it made them very angry. And like a big Luddite move in the United States. I don't know if this happens here. Sorry, I haven't lived here long enough. But when you go to, think about when you go into a supermarket. I know you've all been in a supermarket and you're ready to pay. You're in line at the checkout with your mom or dad or whatever, and you're standing there in line and the person is there to swipe your items across the thing and to ring you up. Well, in the United States, this is a while ago, but they started doing self-checkout, where you don't have to have a person to do it. You swipe your own things and then you pay. Well, people got really mad about that because they said now a machine is doing the job that a human used to have. And so people got really mad about it. It was this anti-technology thing. And I tease them mercilessly. I call them Luddites. Because even though the Luddites were started in the 1800s, and it was because factories were coming about and machines were made for the first time, we can still have Luddites today. So if anyone like your mom or your dad says, well, I didn't have that when I was a kid and I turned out okay, call them a Luddite and tell them Mrs. Gibbons says that you would be a Luddite. And then they're gonna say, what's a Luddite? And you can explain to them, you can teach your parents a little bit about history. And all right, so we're almost finished. In the early 1800s, some people a lot like me, started saying things like, hey, maybe children shouldn't be working so hard. Now, they didn't say maybe children shouldn't be working, because children had always worked. They couldn't even imagine a world where children didn't work. But they said maybe children shouldn't be working 16 hours a day in a mine. And they got together and they started making child labor reform laws. And they made these laws about what children could do at work and what they couldn't do at work, and how many hours a day they could work, and if they should be allowed to have breaks. And they made all these laws and it sounded great, but the factory owners didn't honor it. They didn't care. They were like, oh yeah, sure, whatever, there's some law, but they didn't actually follow the law. So then a job of inspectors was invented. This job had never happened before. We had never had child labor reform laws, so we had never needed an inspector to inspect. Now they've made inspectors whose job is to go to the factory and make sure that they are following these laws. And inspectors like this still exist today. Now, in most, I should have looked this up. I don't know about child labor laws in Kazakhstan, but in the United States, small children can't work. So like these inspectors, they're not actually inspecting child labor reform laws. They're inspecting different laws. But there are all kinds of laws made on factories as to what they can do, what they can't do, how much of this, how much of that. And there are people whose job is to go and make sure that the factories are actually following the laws. And it all started with the child labor reform laws. So, as far as social change, life for, I'm not gonna write this, I'm just gonna say it. Life was really, 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 really bad for most people. But life got a lot better for some people. The rich were rich, just the rich stayed rich. But the middle class, they got better. They rose up because the middle class, it used to be just the rich and the poor. And that was it. The rich, let's say, the rich were like this big, and the poor were like this big. And now, suddenly, you've got the rich and the middle, and you've still got the poor. But before all these factories and things, this class didn't exist at all. It was just the rich and the poor. And so some people say that this development, the Industrial Revolution, was really, really good for society as a whole, because it did help people move up and have better lives. And I think that's it for this lesson. I hope you guys enjoyed it. There's one more coming. How do I stop this thing?